called misq-js for JSON validation. So I'm just kind of curious, who works with JSON here? All right, cool, a lot of people. All right, so hopefully this will be at least somewhat interesting to everybody, maybe even relevant. So I'm going to start off by telling you about 2 problems that I had when I was working with JSON recently. So the first is that if you have too much time on your hands and kind of read the spec really carefully, you find that there's some holes in the spec and also in implementation as well. They let through garbage. And when I say garbage, I mean you put in input and you expect to get maybe a certain thing out and you get something kind of different. So I have a few examples of that up here. This first example is a JSON literal. Is that big enough for everybody to see in the background? Yeah. So we have 2 key value pairs, right? But the 2 keys are the same. So when we parse that, we run that through a JSON parser, what's going to happen? Let me see if I can get my terminal to show up here. All right, so I have this little file here. And let's make that bigger, maybe a little bit too big. All right. So we're going to take that and we're going to put it into just a standard JSON object that comes with Node, it comes with Chrome, it comes with Firefox and all that, and have it parse this file for us. So I have a little script here. All it does is just call the JSON parser. Okay, and if you can see, wow, this is really tough to see what's going on here. Sorry about this, everybody. Let me make this a little bit smaller. So if you can see, what happened here was we had an object where there's 2 key value pairs, ran it through a JSON parser, and we got an object that had just 1 key value pair. And you can see that it gave it the value 2, which was maybe an arbitrary choice between 1 and 2. If you read the JSON spec, it says that you should not have duplicate keys, but it does not say that you cannot. So you're allowed to do that. You do it at your own risk, basically. Let's see, if we go back here, we have some more examples of what I call garbage. So can anybody tell me what's wrong with this number up here? So it's going to be a floating point number. What's the maximum exponent that you can have for a double? Actually, I'm not sure if it's a float or a double, but it's like 310. That's if you have, I think it's a 64-bit double, the max precision you can get, you can go up to 310 for your exponent. So you run that through a JSON parser, what are you going to get? Let's do this again. Go to the second example here. So this is our JSON file. We'll put it into JSON parser, and we get infinity. Okay? So we put in the floating point number 1 times 10 to the 425th, and we get infinity. It's a similar thing if you do really, really small exponents. What's going to be the output? Any guesses?
0.
0, yeah. Although negative infinity is also a good guess. So you put in this, you get this out, okay? This is in the JavaScript JSON parser, but I don't want to just be ragging on JavaScript. You see the same thing happening with the native Python as well. You're going to get 0 for this, and for the other examples, you actually get all the same stuff as for the JavaScript JSON parser. Okay? So that was the first problem that I had when I was working with JSON, was there's this garbage that kind of silently gets into your data. You don't get any warnings, you don't get any errors, it just kind of shows up there when you're least expecting it. The second problem that I had was when I had files where there were parse errors, I didn't always get very good error messages, so it was kind of difficult to figure out what the error was and where it was. And so here I have examples of different kinds of errors that you can have in JSON. So this first example, we have a new line character, you can't put that in a string. We have a missing comma right here. We have an extra comma right here. X is just not JSON, can't put that in there. We have another extra comma, and then we have missing punctuation. Okay, so different kinds of JSON errors. You put them in your JSON parser. Depending on what parser you use and which example it is, you might get a good error message or you might get a bad error message. So let's go back and do a couple more examples. We'll start out with the first one. Okay, so this is where we have a new line and a string literal. And if we put that into Python, we actually get a decent error message. It says invalid control character, line 1, column 8. Okay, so that's good. But if we put it into JavaScript, oops, we get basically something that's worthless. It says there's unexpected token, there's a syntax error, okay, but it doesn't tell us where the error happened. It doesn't tell us what the unexpected token was. But I don't want you to leave with the impression that Python's JSON parser is awesome. So let's look at this one. Can't remember what this is going to do. All right, so this time, all Python tells us is that no JSON object can be decoded. And if you've worked with Python a lot, you'll find out that you actually get that error for lots of different kinds of stuff. So that's pretty much meaningless in terms of actually figuring out what the problem is. Now, of course, it's obvious when you have a tiny example like this. But I was working with files that were about 5 megabytes in size. And so sometimes I had garbage, sometimes I had parse errors. The files have been hand edited, so all kinds of garbage that could be in there. And that's not something that you're going to just find all by yourself when you get an error message that says something stupid like this. So what I did was, well, I wanted a tool that could find these errors for me and help me fix them. I looked around, and there's actually a tool called JSON Validator, and it doesn't do this. It didn't help me to find these kinds of errors. So I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted my tool to do. Just a pretty short list of requirements. I wanted to be able to find all the errors and all the garbage. And when I say all, I mean, like any different kinds of errors that you can think of or things that are weird or whatever. I wanted to be able to report that. Now, obviously, that's a pretty tough goal to say I want 100%, but it was my goal. Whenever there is an error report, I wanted to be very clear about what was going wrong and where it was in the file so I could quickly go there and look at it with my eyes and figure out what was going on. I did not need it to attempt error recovery because I knew that would be complicated, kind of a rabbit hole. You can spend lots of time going down that, trying to figure out how to do automatic error recovery. That wasn't really necessary for me. As long as I could find the errors quickly, that was all I needed to do. So I ended up building this tool called misQ-JS. And just very quickly, the kind of overall design of it, it's a 2-stage error reporting parser. So in the first stage, it parses according to the JSON spec as closely as I can follow it, and it builds a parse tree. As it's going through, it's keeping track of all the active parse rules and building a stack. So when it enters into a rule, it's sort of like your runtime stack, and if you're talking about JavaScript or C or whatever for your active functions. You have this stack, whenever it enters a rule, it pushes a frame on there. So then if at any point during parsing it encounters crappy input, it just reports the stack. And the stack includes the position where each rule started at. So you get a nice trace of all the positions throughout your input. So that's if parsing fails, you get a nice stack trace. If it succeeds, you move on to the second stage. You take this parse tree that was built in the first stage, then you go through it and you look for garbage. So you get 3 possible parse results. You can have errors, that's where you have violations of the JSON spec, invalid JSON, stop, that's red. Then you have your yellow, which is where you have valid JSON, but you have these kind of garbage semantic errors. And then the third one is green, that's where everything's good to go. So let me show you a few examples of this. Let's look at some garbage first. All right, so we'll take this and we'll put it into my little tool. And what we're going to have here is, so this is a kind of JSON object that's dumped out as a string. I hope it's not too hard to read for everybody. What you're going to have here is a status which says which stage that it failed during. So this is not very meaningful, but what it means is that we're in the yellow. So it's valid JSON, but there's garbage. This tells us that we're in an object. We found a duplicate key. The key was A, and the positions that the duplicate key was found at were line 1, column 2, and line 1, column 10, basically. Let's see. So what was another example that we looked at? We saw the floating point overflow. So we put that into this little tool. and we're still in the yellow, so that's what this string here means. This time we're looking at a number. We saw there's an overflow. This is what the input was, and the position was line 1, column 7. Now we can look at some examples where we're talking about red, so actual JSON errors. So we put this in the little tool, and what we're going to get is a stack trace. So you can see we have a different string up here. Again, it's not especially meaningful. I need to change that to make it a little bit better. But here we have the stack trace, and on the left, this is the rule names. On the right is positions. So we started out by parsing JSON at line 1, column 1, obviously. Then we moved on to an object. We went to a key value pair, and you can see that's line 1, column 2, because the key value pair starts at line 1, column 2, right? So then we found the string at line 1, column 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We started the string. Then we were working on a character, line 1, column 8, and then we found out that it was invalid control character.